Downside Up, Chapter 2. Politics had been taken over by a group of lovely, funny young girls. They were hilarious and loved to play around and loved other people. They had turned their school into a musical place, forcing all the teachers to perform in song and dance. It was a musical maths teacher that had been threatened with a sacking if he didn't sing his algebraic equations. There would be bad references for being a party pooper, refusing to sing an algebraic song for the class. Any teacher that didn't have the class in hysterics and laughing could well be replaced by someone that was funnier and someone that was actually entertaining, who barely knew much about the subject perhaps, but at least they could make up some rhymes about it and find the right words to fit it. Boring people had to be putting on a clown-like costume, make it interesting and funny and entertaining. And if they failed to get a laugh, then their sentences would be to be enlisted into playing some funny game, to dressing up and having a funny laugh outside, where they would have to dress up in funny costumes and muck around and pretend to chase each other or to rescue each other or to do weird, funny things. Anything for a laugh, to stop them being so serious. Shoppers were shocked to find no vegetables or fruit, but only endless aisles of cakes and biscuits everywhere, in every shop. Not a vegetable was to be found. Some were reduced to only living on cake alone, ate cake all day, for weeks on end sometimes, without a vegetable to be seen, desperately searching the world for a carrot or a cabbage, hiding cucumbers in drawers. People would smuggle vegetables in to visit people, slipping carrots and potatoes through the bars on windows, even chiseling out books and hiding in avocados or oranges hidden down the back of sofas, even melting chocolate onto apples to hide the fruit under the sweet chocolate, to fool the children and sneak the vegetables in everywhere they could. But still, it was a struggle to get hold of any good vegetables. What with the young girls running things now? The sugar police were out everywhere you went, and really making sure that you had your mandatory sugar doses, and that there weren't any leeks found and celery stalks strapped to people's legs. They could be found on the new X-ray scanners that people were searching. People were searched when they went to places for the hidden vegetables, hidden down trouser legs, even in prams and wheelchairs. All over the place they were found. Groups of people pledged allegiances to Father Christmas, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and pixies and fairies at the bottom of the garden. Those that didn't honour the deities, they were blasphemers. Those that claimed that the fairies didn't exist, those were issued sometimes, even in extreme occasions, with a fatwa. A funwa was given to them to make sure that they did believe in fairies and that they never spoke badly against any of the other fairies, especially the head fairy, the Tooth Fairy herself. Those that spoke badly against her and the others, they could have their own sentence given to them. When fairy representatives could throw fairy dust over you, or throw a fairy wand at you, a mean-looking fairy might stare oddly at you, or any number of bizarre remedies. A group of pensioners had to go out to the park to dance the okey-cokey and to dance wildly back and forth in funny, weird costumes. When they danced a long, drawn-out dance that had them all racing in and out of a circle, back and forth many times, so much so they felt faint, tired with exhaustion of it all. However fun it seemed at first, the half a dozen occasions later, they were quite tired of the repetitive singing the same old chant and the same song, however funny it was the first 5 or 6 times. One man was trapped, having to continually tell a never-ending story that was always having to have happy endings constantly. Constant happy endings every hour of every day, of every week, of every month. It must always get better, happier, always, faster but funnier. And they always had to get constantly more funnier and more happier all the time. Well, he found it a challenge because he wasn't always happy, and he had to find ever increasing other people that were. He had to also get more interesting as well as funnier and happier, as if that wasn't enough of a challenge. All of the challenges, all of the characters in it, he told of them. He had to always end up happier than they were before at the beginning of the day, as if they'd expected a never-ending ascending staircase that would constantly go up to the higher heavens, never-ending, always going up and up and up, and it never getting to any final destination. And they would all get upset if he didn't get even higher and higher and ever higher, or if he tried to ground them all to some reality of their place. First, it was a lovely family he would tell about, who met many other lovely families, and this was the story. And those lovely families that they met, they then loved and got to know their work and their other hobbies and their ways of living, their music and their food and their other stories and things they enjoyed. And they lived in Love-Stantinople, and there was Love Town, and the little Love Village had grown into a Love Town that grew into the City of Love, of course, in the region of Loveshire. Now, that was part of the Love Nation, Lovestenstein, and would have grown really big from the tribe of Love long ago. Well, the storyteller reminded the audience that he had to expand in the next telling, in the rise and ever rise of the empire of love. And the love empires, of course, who'd made love to each other, and that had led to their global love, of course, and different globes, in the end, ended up loving other globes. And so it eventually led later to stories where there were love planets. And he got onto the love planet stories eventually, after many months of telling the various love planet stories. The various loving nation stories that went on and on and on for many months. Finally got on up to the love planet stories that wanted to love and get to know other planets and explore space finally. So onwards, over the weeks, on to the next chapter he had to go, as the happy ever after story had to continue and go on, to keep the young girls ever happier and happier as the days and weeks and months, centuries, decades, millenniums went on and on and on. However long it felt, sometimes he felt trapped, just having to follow it all to its logical conclusions. Not always believing in the stories, although sometimes believing there was something, even though he did try to make some of it sound plausible. After all, everyone did love everyone some of the time. Everyone was loving some of the time. We went to love everyone else, to share the love with them too, even if we don't all of the time. He focused on all of the times that others were loving. Why did the other planets need us to love them, though? Why couldn't we just love our own planet? Didn't they love themselves in outer space, in other planets? Or did they need our planet to love them too? They were the kind of questions that were being asked during his love storytelling that had to ever get happier. An older man had asked him this question. Why are we going on with all this? Why are you now moving on to love planets? After all the months, I got tired and sick, as did you, of the love nation stories, love tribe stories, and the weeks before that, and the lovely people stories. The older, cynical man, or wary man, as he liked to think of himself, had asked the storyteller the question why he was even doing all this. But of course he felt he had to. The children pressured him to, perhaps. The older man had asked him this, though in serious and of concern for him. Then, seeing the expectant audience, he'd said that they too were always happy, always. Of course they were, all of them. They loved each other too, albeit in very different ways. And even if it was a small amount, it was still love. And you can always love others you haven't met yet more. The storyteller had to say, we can always have more and more love. If you love hundreds, it doesn't mean you can't love many more and add to it. There could be no end of additions and multiplications, the lovely mathematician had to say. No end to the numbers of loveliness and of those that you can go on to love. The storyteller said it to the older, weary man, as if trying to convince him, or himself perhaps, of the ever-happening story that he was now trapped in having to tell. Oh, he was exhausted and tired of it sometimes, though. He wanted to mention that there were lovely, sad, or even forgotten about planets out there too, though, and thought often about sadder planets, not just happier ones that were lovely, but more like he suspected that they were empty of life, maybe, and no one lived there. But that wouldn't really fit the regulations. You couldn't have empty planets out there to discover. They had to be lovely planets, didn't they? Well, he was struggling to work out what would be happy about an empty planet, although he hadn't introduced empty planets yet into the ever-happy story. The shrilly melodic music, with the high-pitched squeaking, screeching sounds, screaming out loud, had awoken him every morning, full of the songs and dances and rhymes, all so funny, all of the day long. It just wearied him and went on and on and on and on. An obstacle course of toys he was constantly having to hop over and dot around and sidestep, and constantly having to be wary of, left down the stairs for him to jumble over and skip over and leap over sometimes. To get around the conveyor belt of the cake parties, the trolleys and stacked full of biscuits, the crumbs that trails led everywhere to unfinished, half-bitten, sandwich-filled plates stacked and left on tables, with dozens of empty glasses strewn about the place. And you were left dreaming of vegetables, hungry for the earth itself, with empty rhymings all the time, endless forced rhymings that he was forced to do, in the ever weird rhymings that were forced upon him to make the song so funny and work and flow together somehow. But laughing at the weird sounds sometimes, however unpleasant to the person, this could not last and could not go on in the house. Another change was surely possible and surely would happen in time. It couldn't always just get happier and happier, and neither could he go on telling the ever happying story. He didn't feel ever happier himself sometimes, and he didn't feel others were either. Another coup, another change of power, or something else was possible, and it was followed as some an older grieving widowers, as if this older was then forcing everyone else to go into a long period of mourning, and everything changed again, as it did so often. Or was it occasionally? Symbolically, empty chairs were then placed everywhere. The older had taken control of the small house now, and the children now were sleeping and tired and more restful, and were just upstairs in their bedrooms or going out and not doing so much. And the grieving older had now taken control, placing symbolically empty chairs and plates everywhere. Empty chairs were placed all around the long empty tables for them to have supper at, to remind them of the emptiness, the coldness, and the lostness of the past, and what he felt that he was grieving for, but they were not, somehow. Well, he had lots of empty plates and cups put out around them that would not be served, and left them out there, where this became mandatory and a preoccupation for all that attended the empty tables regularly, with empty chairs scattered all around them. There were empty books when they went to go to the shelves suddenly, without a word to be in them, and only pens left on the side, with no words left in the books. Never mind any funny or happy stories. Mortuary school was established, and funny school, happy school was gone for the day, for the evening, as it was now renamed and changed once more. The history of death was now taught and was mandatory, and happy stories were put aside, and death stories now introduced. And those would be mandatory, and everyone must study those, and study them closely, and sing about them too, as well as write about them, and even perform a small dance too. Notable historical deaths of people, of animals and nations and tribes and worlds, and also of empires, on occupations and beliefs and genders and sexualities, of races, and of everything must be taught to everyone. Artistic deaths were taught, of course, as were political deaths, religious deaths, philosophical deaths, social deaths, financial deaths, mental deaths, and physical deaths as well. It was all going to be a curriculum of death and not fun and games and happiness from now on. Dead languages only would be studied, and no living ones anymore. And the dead languages would be taught so that people could speak or read only the language of the dead anymore, and never of the living. Biological deaths were studied, as were the alchemical deaths too, the physiology of death, as well as its chemistry, and the physiological processes of it as well. In geography death classes, they learnt then about the deserts of extinction, and that was the only thing really. For a lot of the semesters, there was a big focus. The past cataclysms, and the future possible ones too. The past quakes, floods, wildfires, tornadoes, volcanoes, and even plagues. They were the main topics that had to be studied through those months and weeks and years ahead. Oh, decades ahead of it to be studied, reassured the mortuary teacher, saying that they needn't worry that there will be a shortage because there's always more of it for them to study, and things will always get ever harder. Then, if the hundreds of millions of deaths and the billions that they go on to over the months, those weren't enough to overwhelm the students, of course, attending the dead schools regularly, then there were the astronomical deaths that had to be studied too. The deaths of trillions, quadrillions, countless stars that had died, billions of star deaths that had to be studied too. The sun deaths, of course, as they were really, but they were star deaths in their billions, trillions, and quadrillions. Deaths that were unimaginable, countless, and to scales that one could only dream of and not even imagine. Deaths on epic proportions, unimaginable even to the mind, the heart, or the soul. And that's what we'd all proceed upon eventually. Needn't worry that there will be a shortage of death studies for all ardent students that love their studies. We would all go on to study those eventually. So, of course, we'd go on to study the unimaginable deaths eventually, so that the limitations of death were as far as life itself, and only bound by what we really knew of it, science itself, that was ever progressing towards more understanding. So it would always produce more death understanding, more death stories, and many more things to study in the future, many more death stars that would be studied and known of in future times. All of the dead stars that were studied already, and the dead suns, of course, and dead planets. Many of those that had been studied quite well, but there were hundreds and thousands of more to be excited about going on to study, enthused the mortuary head teacher to the weary class, no longer weary of the fun and happy ending stories, though. Still, it was an interesting, different contrast for the rest of them, at least, that hadn't wanted either, particularly, including one of the older men, that now felt it was going too far in another direction. How many different directions could it all go in, though? But there was just so much about death to be fascinated and intrigued about, one of the deaf teachers has said, during the sullen class. And the older man, feeling quite depressed at hearing about all of this over these weeks and many months and years some of the classes had gone on for, but at the thought of it all progressing even further, and onto the whole university of death and universal dying, as if Earth dying wasn't just enough for us all, but the idea of many, many Earths, and thousands of Earths dying, and millions of Earths dying, that we'd all progress to the dead universe eventually, as if a dead Earth wasn't hard enough for him to struggle with. Never mind the suggestions of an unknowing or dying or dead universe, still beyond their knowledge as a race of people. But he felt so low just about the prospect of going on to that eventually. What was that a kind of thing to aspire to and progress towards and to look forwards to? How could he ever look forwards to that, though? How could they all? He almost wished for a return back to the young girls, back to the happy old days, their fun excitement and their joy of life, their relentless optimism. It was something, wasn't it? Even if it was exhaustive and trying and unsustainable in its own way, but it was a kind of fun. A joy of life was in that, and in them too. And he almost missed them now and wished he hadn't wished them all away after all. Now, after a long, long time of the mandatory grieving, they all had to be in constant grief for everyone and everything and every place all the time. Now he wished and longed for the long ago mandatory fun, when everyone had to be pushed to enjoy themselves and lighten up and love and have fun with others as much as they could all the time. And he almost longed for those days. He no longer wished for the ultra happiness nor the ultra sadness now, to be his only goal and objective, and hoped that someone would bring him some balance to it all, even if it couldn't be himself, and stop this swinging pendulum in the house, going back and forth, because there were so many of them in it, and he just felt led this way and then that way, and kept changing. Yet for now he worked for the grieving sisters anyway, whose ever morbid curiosity still drove him on, as he had those morbid curiosities too, as well as his fun curiosities that he'd had earlier, and those curiosities that had grown wilder, and much more, as the storyteller now felt trapped in the ever-depressing story. To provide a new horror, a new twist, new escalation, to keep the story ever more sensational, mortifying, shocking, disturbing, horrible, sad, so that they would never be satisfied until they knew the whole universe was sharing their suffering and their sorrow and would understand it, or until they shared the grief, until they themselves could learn to understand the grief of the universe too. Where would it end? They'd want to understand and grieve for other universes beyond those, and beyond the known universe. The story had to just get progressively worse and ever more tragic as the weeks and then the months of dying and isolated sick planets. That wasn't enough. Then there had to be isolated sick universes, and it would just go on, logically, surely. He was trapped in the ever grieving story, the ever saddening story. Where would it all end? Why did it all have to go on? Or did it? He had to be. Was it all that bad? A dying, isolated man, a sick man. Oh, that wasn't enough to get an interesting story. Then he had to be assaulted, made homeless, then go mental, self-harm, or do something awful. Then maybe get imprisoned or something. But that would, in a violent, awful prison or something. And then maybe he'd have to have his head cut off and carry on having to live for years later with only being a head or something, trapped in a glass jar, and then lose one eye, and then eventually he'd go deaf or something and not know he was. But it had to keep getting worse and worse, didn't it? With a dying, isolated, sick planet that was preyed upon and assaulted by alien planets in another story, and then an Earth that would have no place in a universe, in a league of planets. Then it would be a mental planet, and he created many awful ideas. He had to please the morbid sisters in their desire to find out and know much more. And then, of course, he had to have aliens that were invading Earth, demonizing aliens, awful aliens that he knew nothing about. And he felt so bad almost about even having to invent it, even if it did seem to please them or to satisfy them in some weird way. He attempted to make up for it and told of many of the grieving alien planets that there were, though, who weren't part of any of the assaults on the Earthling and on the Earth planet, as they were too suffering the great hardships. And there it was, the next logical conclusion of that story. He had not wanted to arrive at yet, felt compelled to. with a vast number of the dying planets he'd had to tell about in the ever-saddening story. Across the universe, so many lonely planets he had to keep adding into the story, many more grieving planets, so much that even on the happiest, the kindest, and the most successful planets that had some hardships, all planets, like all people, had known some suffering. So in the universe of suffering, all alien sufferings were everywhere. Each, if they suffered at different times and at different places, though. There was a childish infatuation with the star-love saga, had ended in the orgy of the stars, and a party of spectacular lights, a disco in the sky and space. When it's dark, and so then the bright, flickering, dancing lights really had stood out well in the flammable, sparkling costumes that were flickering and dancing all over the place. And then, only weeks later, under the new melancholic regime, those fun, light-filled dances, the light-hearted dances, when those had changed. And then the infatuation had moved on, and we'd all progressed. And our star-lust, our star-love obsession had moved on to star-death epics. And the star-death and the conveyor belt of the tragic sufferings, when a billion stars lay dying, and a billion stars forgotten, and a billion stars had all unknown themselves, and a billion stars that were a part of different things they didn't understand. There were all these other weirdnesses as well. The conveyor belt of tragic sufferings was seen as a merciful ending, though, to have all of the billion stars dying, and not a failure always, when lights just slowly faded away on many planets, and fuel gradually emptied very slowly, like the slowing, ever-dimmering sunset, when light slowly seeps away, ever fainter and fainter, where it shrinks gradually, slower and slower, until finally, faintly, it's then gradually going and gone, and it finally extinguished. And hundreds and millions of planets that he had to talk about that could potentially be like that, inventing the stories for them of those different worlds, the few that he could think of. Until eventually the dying planet, the suffering planets had all vanished and gone. What happened to all the planets left, though, in the darkness, when all those stars had died and gone, and all left? Billion stars all gone, with half a universe in darkness, and the rest awaiting to join them, just at later various appointments in the near or distant future. Their third guide during their stay at the house, or what was a summer holiday. It was a group get-together, a study place where they could live together and study together, consisted of several mothers that then took over in the later night during their nightly class, where they would have their own rules that they could introduce to the group, that the group should follow just for their hours of the day, taking over from the older, grieving men and the other women that had led the evening grieving discussions, and their shows and stories too. The older matriarchs had grown tired, though, of the struggle earlier on in the day between the younger innocents and then the older grievers, those in grief in the evening. And then they had talked themselves, the mothers, they had talked of the star births, and told of the youths that in the union of love, where a star was born, and where planets themselves were born, in the orgy of the stars, when the love stars came together, and that star lovers gave birth to stars in the sky all the time, thousands, millions, and even billions of stars that had all been born from the star love conceptions. All the stars were conceived in the star love itself, said some of the mothers, to the children, of course, though they would say much more about some of the other aspects of the star love later to the other older adults. There were many other of the star love stories to talk about at different hours during their long presentations. Even though the grieving elder knew this, of course, was only a half or perhaps a third of the truth, and there were many more other kind of mystery conceptions of stars that had not really been explained, nor known about, nor perhaps should be to the children. He didn't even need to say what wasn't necessary under the mother's rules. That was their rules, and he had to abide by them, even though he hadn't when he got on about death enough. And that was a different rule, a different age, some time ago. Besides, he was glad not to tell the stories about any of the star rapes and the planetary rape anymore. He'd had enough about universal rapes and different planets raping other planets and about all sorts of other things and taking possession of different planets and other parts of the universe. The hours of talking about star suicides that had happened and all the planets that had committed ecocide, the thousands and millions of them, ecocides all across the universe, and it had grown depressing and tiring even going on about all that. So he was glad to have moved on and not to have be talking about that. And that star birth was now much more of a feature, and that star growing and star infancy and star children were much more of a focus of many of the more interesting, funny stories. They were more common in the universe. Others all new. So it was good telling different stories. Or did we know all of the hidden hardships, as well as the joys, that are similar, but to many other different parts of unknown places? They talked about different planets that perhaps had been unknown,